Okay, this class is going to look at sustainable agriculture. And sustainable agriculture really has three key features, which is social sustainability. There needs to be a sense of social equity between the workers and the owners of farms. Too often there's a wide social difference, but if this continues for too long, the workers might rebel, uh, and therefore this will threaten the existence of the farm. It must also be environmentally sustainable, and it must be financially sustainable. Clearly, if a farm isn't making a profit, it will go bankrupt. And all three of those are required for a farm to be sustainable in the long term. Any of those are wrong, and the farm will not be sustainable. So, what are we going to look at today? The objectives. Explain the features of sustainable agriculture. And notice it's talking about features. And we're going to separate features from practices. And we'll learn about sustainable practices in the next class. And we're going to talk about sustainable features. We need to talk about ecological integrity, economic viability, social equity, and adaptability. Of course, farms need to be able to adapt to different circumstances. Climate change, for example, might mean that certain crops can't be grown anymore, and people's nutritional tastes might change. So, what was desirable at one time is no longer desirable. And we're going to discuss threats to sustainable agriculture, such as natural disasters, flood, hurricanes, and volcanoes, climate change, temperature rise, sea level rise, and change in precipitation. So you have heavy rain followed by drought. Then you have external shocks and of global markets, etc. I suppose the war in Ukraine can be considered an external shock. And because Ukraine produced a lot of wheat prices are going up. Then certification to meet international standards. And this is a bit of a racket, really. Rich countries can have protectionist standards which prevent third world countries and less developed countries from importing into the United States, whereas their own produce doesn't meet the international standards. And there's the importation of cheap uh, products. Let's see what that's. It's cheap agricultural products. Now, sustainable agriculture refers to the ability to produce sufficient quantities of food and fiber to meet the needs of a population without compromising productivity for future generations. We need to know this, as we might be asked to define sustainable agriculture. And it's able to produce sufficient quantities of food and fiber to meet the needs of the population without compromising the productivity for future generations. And for agriculture, three features have been realized. It must be ecologically sustainable, socially sustainable, and financially sustainable. And it should also be able to adapt to make changes according to prevailing circumstances, which might be changes in the climate, or changes in what people want to eat. So, ecological sustainability then. It is important that farming should not harm the environment, which provides important ecological services. For example, trees bring rain, insects pollinate crops, and without this pollination, fruit will not form. These services provide a habitat for beneficial birds and insects, modification of microclimate. Of course, clearing land and building cement changes the microclimate, so that, for example, the building of Shoppers Fair and the NCB Bank, where there's lots of cement, means that the daytime around Manchester High School can get quite a bit warmer. I suppose also because it's got lots of cement, the amount of flooding will increase because the water won't go under the ground or into the ground. It'll just run off. So without these services, the viability of the farm itself is threatened. So farming might harm the surrounding environment, which then therefore threatens the viability of the farm. But while we're talking about that, we should also remember the farm itself is an ecosystem that requires constant human input in order to be maintained. However, the smaller the input, the more sustainable the farming is. That's important. We need to do farming where the input we put in is very small. And as far as possible, the farm should be integrated into the surrounding ecosystem, and the surrounding ecosystem harmed as little as possible. So indigenous farmers in the Amazon, for example, do little harm to the environment because the rainforest can recover after the land has been cleared for agriculture. But this is not the case with modern methods, which clear vast areas of rainforest each day. So in Brazil, lots of rainforest is being cleared. And there's a question as to whether this land will ever be able to recover from the abuse that it's being subjected to now. Another thing is economic viability, and farms can be an expensive enterprise due to heavy-duty machinery, inorganic fertilizers and pesticides, and a large labor force. However, produce at the start of any planting season is never guaranteed due to a wide range of possible threats. So any season there can be threats which can prevent profit. An example, you can think of bananas in St. Thomas, which were affected by back-to-back hurricanes in the early 1990s. And one year there was a hurricane which destroyed the banana crop. And then the next year there was another hurricane which destroyed the banana crop. And failing to harvest any bananas 2 years running caused the banana company to become bankrupt. But possible threats, you can have drought, flooding, hurricanes, plant and animal diseases. And I suppose that one again, plant and animal diseases, means that monocropping is probably not a good idea for that reason as well. Labour unrest, trade and larceny, fluctuation in market prices. So notice again, social inequity can cause social unrest, which therefore threatens economic viability. And the farm needs to have sufficient financial capital to withstand complete failure in any one year. And probably more than 1 year for that matter. So economic sustainability can be increased by growing a wide variety of crops. And this reduces the chance of diseases, since most diseases are specific to specific crops. It makes a farm more resistant to adverse weather conditions. So some crops are more tolerant to hurricanes, droughts, flooding, etc. So growing a variety of crops helps with adverse weather conditions, and it's less threatened by market prices, as prices of different crops fluctuate at different times. If you grow just one crop and there's a glut on the market, and therefore prices go down, your activity is going to be challenged. The use of organic fertilizers. These are cheaper and maintain soil quality, and in a mixed farm, the manure can be obtained from animals. Less dependence on heavy-duty machinery, since these are expensive to buy and maintain, and you can borrow money from relatives and members of the community, so the interest rates are less. Then there's social equity. The relationship between farm workers and farm owners has always been one of contentions. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 was largely a consequence of grievances of agricultural workers, and since that time many uprisings have been a consequence of a lack of social equity between owners of capital and those exploited by it. We can think of Caribbean agricultural productivity depended on slavery, and though this social inequity was maintained for centuries, it was not sustainable. And even today, social uprisings continue as a consequence of social inequity. So I said something about commodifying labor. So capitalism's primary characteristic is its profit-driven need to commodify and exploit wage labor. And this can only happen if the producers, the workers, can be separated from their means of production, the tools, the land, etc. So the laborers don't own land or tools, etc. They just do the work. And historically, this was done by coercion and force. So what happens is the workers have no choice but to work for the farm owners. So it says, once separated from their tools, workers have nothing to sell but their labour power, which they must sell to capitalists, who now own the means of production. And this led to the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution before it. And what it suggests is that sustainable development is not possible without a sense of social equity, because workers will rebel. And then we have adaptability. A farm needs to adapt to according to changes in weather patterns, presence of pathogens, and demands of the public. We mentioned in Ireland in the 19th century there was a famine due to potato blight, and many people starved because the country was unable to adapt and produce different crops. All the Irish did was grow potatoes, and because there was a potato blight and all the potatoes failed, then there was a massive famine. So it's important to be adaptable. And due to climate change and unpredictability in world markets, it's very important that farms can adapt to changes present. And this is price changes and everything else. Then threats to sustainable agriculture. Know that any threat to agricultural production is also a threat to sustainable agriculture. So climate change. Rising sea levels will reduce the amount of land available for agriculture. Multi-level farms can reduce this threat, or undersea farms is another. possibility. I suppose you can have greenhouses under the water where you have air which is pumped in and so on. And you can grow things under the, you have farms under the sea. So you can watch these two YouTube documentaries. And then you have external shocks, and these refer to occurrences outside of agriculture that can impact on productivity or profit. Example, volcanoes, such as Montserrat or St. Vincent. And volcanoes can cause dislocation of people. In Montserrat, the entire capital, Plymouth, was buried by lava in 1995. And volcanic eruptions destroy all types of agriculture. And more recently, volcanic activity disrupted St. Vincent. Pandemics is another big external shocks. In Jamaica, a great deal of farming produce is used for local hotels in the tourist market. And during lockdown activities, these farmers lost their customers. You might remember hearing about it last year and the year before, when there was no tourists coming to Jamaica, and a lot of Jamaican farmers, all their produce was sold to the hotels. And therefore, because the hotels were locked down, these farmers couldn't make any money. So that's an external shock which threatens sustainability. And hurricanes can make farms unsustainable. So banana plantations in St. Thomas in Jamaica. And severe drought can reduce productivity and make farms economically unviable. Certification to meet international standards is often used by developed countries to prevent importation of similar products from developing countries. I mentioned Milo made in Jamaica could not be exported to USA because its sugar content was too high. But Nesquik made in USA could be imported to Jamaica, even though its sugar content was higher. And small farmers also find it more difficult to maintain specific standards, making certification more difficult. Small farmers find it harder to maintain crops at a specific quality because they're much more vulnerable to changes in the external surroundings. So certification makes it harder for small farmers to compete and export on an international scale. And developed countries often buy surplus agriculture from farms in order to stabilize prices. And this produce is often sold to developing countries at low prices. And the markets in these countries can be flooded with cheap produce, and the local farmers can't compete with these. And this basically finishes this presentation.